Well, welcome back to session 2. Thank you. If I can do something. Thank you very much indeed. So welcome back to session 2, the politics of reconstruction. Just as a reminder, this session is on the record and is open to the media. If you wish to tweet, please use hashtag #CHSyria. We're going to be dealing with the knotty subject on politics of reconstruction. So we've got 90 minutes to have hopefully a sort of fluid conversation and interaction. I'm joined by 3 excellent panelists. To my far left, Nader Kabani. He's Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and Senior Fellow with the Brookings Global Economy and Development Program. He previously served as Director of Policy and Research at the Silatech Foundation and is the founding director of the Syrian Development Research Center at the Syria Trust for Development. Further details are sort of in your pack. Then I'm joined by, in the middle, Steve Hademan, who I've known for quite some time and used to read your work when I was doing my master's and PhD, not to age you, of course, but...
I was precocious when I wrote this. That was brilliant.
Steve is the Janet Wright Ketchum 1953 Professor in Middle East Studies and Director of Program in Middle East Studies at Smith College. He's also a non-resident Senior Fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy of the Brookings Institution. He has previously held a number of leadership positions at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. And then to my immediate left, Ali Mubayyad, who is Managing Director covering economics and fixed income strategy for emerging Europe, Middle East, and Africa at Jefferies International. She was the Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy Program at the IISS, I'm going to go straight to that, after spending 9 years as MENA Chief Economist at Barclays. We've got a lot of expertise on the panel, but I should also say we've got a lot of expertise and experience, of course, in the room, and we really sort of want to draw upon that during this session. Now, I've been sort of drafted in to chair this session a little late, so I'm going to do my best to sort of see what I can do. And I'm a bit of a stickler for the rules, and this is our goal for the session. We want to explore the current political context and funding mechanisms for reconstruction, and the social, economic, and demographic implications for Syrians inside and outside of the country. What's most important for me is it says we're going to offer some policy recommendations in support of formation of an inclusive reconstruction process. So what I'd love to do by the end of this 90 minutes, between the panel and yourselves, is at least have a list of 3 or 4 sort of policy recommendations that we can then push forward. So I really want to work you hard during this 90 minutes. Steve, I'm going to start the first question with you. What are the general conditions for having an effective and inclusive reconstruction process? To what extent does the current situation in Syria meet these conditions now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Thank you also to Chatham House for inviting me to be part of this meeting. I'm very, very pleased to be here. There were 2 really important words that help frame how this conversation about reconstruction should proceed: inclusive and effective. And I think perhaps the best starting point for responding to the question is to be clear about what kind of reconstruction process falls outside of that definition. And the process that would fall outside of that definition, in my view, is one that legitimates the current outcome of the conflict in military terms, in terms of a process that simply consolidates and institutionalizes the distribution of power and access to economic resources and access to opportunities for reconstruction and the benefits of reconstruction in ways that reflect the conditions that were brought about as a result of the conflict. I think we also have to recognize that an effective and inclusive reconstruction process will not result from programs that simply try to restore Syria to the conditions that existed prior to 2011. So in other words, what's needed for a process to be considered both inclusive and effective is a process of reconstruction that responds to the conditions that drove Syria into conflict in 2011, on one hand, mitigates those conditions so that reconstruction does not simply lay the groundwork for a return to conflict at some point in the future, and in addition, a process of reconstruction that mitigates some of the effects of the conflict on those who have been most negatively affected by it, most harmed by it. So what are the conditions that would be needed in order to achieve that kind of a process of reconstruction? Well, I think we would have to acknowledge that there would have to be within Syria, among those in charge in Syria now, a commitment to the protection of property rights, for instance, of those who were forced to flee their homes as a result of conflict or who were forced out of their homes as a result of conflict, including both refugees and IDPs. I think it would require a recognition of the importance of providing security and support for those communities who have fled, to feel that they are able to return to their homes, to begin to rebuild in ways that will not expose them to risks from either the regime or its local loyalists on the ground. And I think there are a number of other conditions as well that we can spin off along similar lines that would ensure that those who are willing to participate in reconstruction are not exposed, not vulnerable to the expropriation or exploitation or abuse of their participation in reconstruction by the regime. Finally, and this is perhaps the most daunting condition that I think would need to be met in order to achieve effective and inclusive reconstruction, we need a vision of what we want reconstruction to be. We need a vision of what we think reconstruction is moving Syria towards. And I am afraid that right now there are multiple conflicting visions of what reconstruction is intended to accomplish. There is a regime vision of reconstruction, which we'll discuss as the panel develops. There is a vision of reconstruction held by the EU, just completed another round of discussions in Brussels about Syria recently, in which it made clear the kind of conditions it felt would need to be met in order to be able to engage in reconstruction. So at the moment, when we think about whether or not conditions for effective, inclusive reconstruction exist, I think the answer has to be that they do not exist, that we're still a very long way away from having those kinds of conditions in place. The legal regulatory structures inside of Syria do not exist. The regime's vision of what reconstruction is intended to accomplish actually rejects principles of inclusion in favor of a commitment to rewarding loyalists, to reimposing its authority over the country, using reconstruction as a tool to reimpose its authority over the country, and so on. And so we're at a moment in which the ambition to achieve an inclusive and effective process of reconstruction by external actors and by a number of Syrians as well bumps up against extraordinary resistance from the Syrian regime, from the government of Bashar al-Assad, who views that vision of reconstruction as fundamentally at odds with the ways it believes that reconstruction should be used as a process of authoritarian regime regeneration. And until that tension is addressed, I think we should be cautious about the possibilities for achieving conditions that will be responsive to the criteria for a inclusive and effective process of reconstruction.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, it would be good at some point, maybe later in a conversation, to think about those tensions and how one can shift that or address that, moving from point A to point B, which is clearly, I mean, there's a huge chasm there, clearly. Alia, do you want to take a bite at this question?
No, I mean, I just have, I think Steve laid out really the framework comprehensively. I think it is just important to emphasize that, of course, we are talking about a process that does not only involve, that involves a complex set of elements. I mean, I come also from Lebanon, and we've gone through this process at the end of the war. And now that we reflect back on it, I mean, we see that we were mainly focusing on political stabilization with the Ta'if agreement and maybe some sort of the plan, the reconstruction plan that the government that laid out the reconstruction process in terms of infrastructure and physical infrastructure. But what we left actually out of our reconstruction framework clearly, and we are just living 20 and 30 years after just to witness that, is really all the aspects that deal with the aspects of governance and institution building. And the way we have decided, we have decided to, and I mean, it's not that we have decided to miss the opportunity to reshape our economy in a different way than it was before the war. And I think if the opportunity is there for Syrians to do it, I think this is what should be done, i.e. really look at those underlying causes that led to the conflict. Those are primarily socio-economic and not only, and of course political, but very much socio-economic, whether in terms of inequality, whether in terms of the way we have done urban planning for our cities, whether in terms of the industrial policies that were used, particularly in Syria, to encourage this or favor this or that sectors, independent of the comparative advantages of the country and the skills of its population. I think this is the opportunity to put all this in this new framework or this new vision that is much needed. I think the focus on governance and institutions should be, in my view, essential, because this is the only thing that, if you miss it, it's very hard to rebuild it and to reverse it in the future.
Thank you, Ali. Nader, I want to bring you on another point in a minute. Did you have anything to add to this sort of part of the discussion?
I think we need to keep two things in mind simultaneously, and they're complementary. I don't think they're contradictory. So, I mean, I agree with what Stephen said in terms of laying out the overall vision for, if you want to do construction, there needs to be clear guiding principles involving really inclusion, effectiveness, and ensuring that the work is carried out correctly. But it's also important to come at reconstruction from the other point of view, so to flip it on its head. Basically, given the situation in Syria and how it's evolving, is there anything, what can be done? Is there anything that can be done to nudge the country in the right direction? And that involves reconstruction, but in a very different approach to reconstruction. Reconstruction much more at a smaller scale, at a targeted scale. It's important to not leave here thinking that there's basically an on-off switch. We're going to either go on construction or there's not. The big project, yes, but it's impossible to keep in mind that you need to do small things. And I'm reminded of a World Bank report that came out about 15 years ago after the 9/11 attacks. And the World Bank did a very introspective assessment of its role in kind of post-conflict reconstruction in Afghanistan. It was also thinking about Iraq. And the main point of the report, as well as the report on basically the reconstruction, what happened in Iraq, another similar analyses come out of this, is that essentially for extremist groups and terrorists to emerge, you need essentially failed states. You need kind of lack of states. You need this kind of gap. And Otherwise, there always exist in every society some extremist groups. But for them to become organized, to be able to undertake, to become majorly disruptive, like ISIS in Syria, you need kind of a withdrawal of effective governance from those institutions and from those areas. And so, if you leave it out as basically an on-off switch in terms of Syria now, reconstruct or not reconstruct, and the answer is not reconstruct until certain conditions are met, you have several years potentially where you have failed states situations in many parts of the country. I don't think that's a good answer either. So I think there's a middle road that we need to explore in the context of this panel.
Steve, you mentioned the regime's vision for reconstruction. Could you maybe unpack that for us? What does that look like? Where is that heading and intending?
Well, I've written about my sense of the regime's approach to reconstruction, which I've tended to define in terms of reconstructing authoritarianism. And so I think there are a number of objectives that the regime has linked to the process of economic reconstruction, to the repair of infrastructure, to the rebuilding of communities. One is to simply use reconstruction as an opportunity to reassert its authority in the areas that it has retaken that were formerly held by opposition forces for an extended period of time. And so it wants to use its control over the allocation of reconstruction resources as an incentive that will give it leverage within communities where it feels that it can take advantage of rebuilding of just the physical aspects of reconstruction, the restoration of economic normalcy to enhance its legitimacy, and to build again a very visible, a very forceful presence in these communities where it may feel that to some extent its local authority was compromised during extended periods in which that territory was out of its control. In addition, I think it also has a vision in which it wants to use reconstruction as a way to cement some of the demographic shifts that Syria experienced as a result of the conflict, forced displacement of communities viewed as disloyal by the regime, ensuring that there are areas of the country that were seen as critical to the support of the uprising, the insurgency from 2011 onward, that can be re-engineered, rebuilt in ways that will permanently exclude those who it felt demonstrated their disloyalty to the regime. And we, as was mentioned in the first panel, do have this discourse of treason and of disloyalty that the regime attaches to many of those who fled their homes as a result of the conflict. So there's a demographic component to how it views the process of reconstruction. And in addition, it sees reconstruction, particularly to the extent that it can secure funding from actors like the EU, but from others as well, as an opportunity to reward those who remained loyal to the regime throughout the period of the uprising. And so we see very, very clear patterns in how the regime is pursuing reconstruction, in which punishing and excluding, marginalizing those it views as disloyal is part of the process, reasserting its authority, consolidating demographic shifts, engaging in processes of urban reconstruction, for example, that will make it permanently impossible for residents of certain neighborhoods associated with the uprising to return, especially in the Ghouta, the area to the east of Damascus, but not only those areas. Around Homs, around Hamma, we're seeing similar kinds of processes at work in which these uneven patterns of public investment in small-scale reconstruction reflect that political intent on the part of the regime. And the sorts of projects that are being put forward as the cornerstones of reconstruction, I think, amplify all of these impressions about how the regime intends to make use of it. In particular, these two now fairly notorious projects of Basilia city and Marota city, in the suburban outskirts of Damascus, which are intended to be these massive, massive projects covering thousands of hectares, in which whole neighborhoods have been bulldozed and demolished to clear space for key regime cronies to play key roles as investors in enormous, enormous urban development projects that will produce neighborhoods like Solidaire in downtown Beirut. Upscale condominiums, upscale shopping, luxury areas, things like that. And there's a bit of real kind of fantasy and delusion about the idea that this is the kind of reconstruction that the regime should be treating as a priority. I've heard from some colleagues, economists inside Syria, that at the moment, the anticipated asking price for condominiums to be constructed in Marota city, beginning asking price is $700,000. The idea that we have a huge audience of consumers able to pay those kinds of prices is a little off. But nonetheless, it reflects on the mindset of those who are taking the lead in this reconstruction process. And what's important to understand is that the regime has built the legal and regulatory infrastructure with this kind of a process in mind. So, for example, a law that was referenced in the earlier panel, law number 10, explicitly envisions administrative routines for how certain properties are designated as available for development that are going to privilege actors close to the regime. And so the way in which the regime is pursuing reconstruction, I think, gives us very, very clear evidence precisely of how significantly its approach differs from any kind of meaningful commitment to what we've been discussing as inclusive and effective reform.
Thank you. You've used terms like bumping up against extraordinary resistance in terms of what the international community would be coming up to. What you seem to describe is, it's like almost an irresistible process of attrition, almost. I mean, as you're what you're describing in my mind, I have this sort of glacier that's just moving. Actually, it's not that slowly. It's moving quite quickly, in fact, and just taking everything with it in its wake. So I really want to, in a minute, get to see how does one prevent that, or what are the ways of reconciling, if one can, the tensions that you alluded to earlier. But before I do that, Alia, Steve sort of used the term, reconstruction resources and those that are available. Where are those resources? I mean, I keep hearing Russia doesn't have the financial, welly, neither does Iran. We can see, the Gulf states are reestablishing, some of them at least, opening their embassies, reestablishing highways to Syria. Is that where the resources are going to come from?
Well, it is true that there are a lot of question marks in terms of who is going to foot the bill, and just looking at the numbers that now are used by many researchers. I mean, whether it's 250 billion that was estimated, or the 400 billion figure that the regime keeps on talking about. I mean, whatever this figure is for me it just begs the question of what would be the terms of engagement of these potential, basically external actors that in order for them to engage. And it's very clear that I think you have two types of actors: those who want and are already engaged but don't have enough, and those don't have money enough because of the sanctions, whether it's Russia or Iran in particular, and those who have but who are hesitating because and who want because they have excess capacity at home, and these are the GCC countries, particularly if we look at the economies of the GCC and at their contractors company. I mean, they badly want to engage in either Iraq or in Syria. I mean, down the line in Yemen, but Yemen is proving to be there is an excess capacity in the Gulf on the definitely on their construction and contractors side, the MR, of this world, and the Bin Ladens, etc., etc. That Syria provides an ideal place for them to engage in such opportunities. But then also there is the motive of basically containing Iran, right? I mean, and being there for that purpose. For me, I think the question is whether these different forces would compete or would cooperate at some point. And we just heard in the previous session that we are seeing a bit of both, at least between Russia and Iran. I think the other potential player is obviously China, but then China also, I think Steve wrote about this $2 billion that has been pledged by China. I mean, there is this geostrategic case to make for Chinese involvement, but we have seen also China promise funding and hesitate in the region. I mean, and now if the U.S. withdrawal is down, is something that could happen, how much China is committed and under what terms. So for me, what is still not clear is on what terms all these external actors, besides Russia and Iran, what will it take them to get their money where the opportunities are. I think the other key players is some of these international financial institutions. And today, of course, the global, the context is only amenable to a small-scale intervention and financing. And this is what we are seeing with the UNDP projects, the crisis responses that we are seeing mainly at the local level. Can this be the way to go in terms, if you fail to have the broader, big umbrella kind of financing under the World Bank that we have seen in other countries, that you would resort to small-scale approach to funding reconstruction? That's also on the table. I think the whole landscape remains very unclear to me in terms of the additional players beyond Russia and Iran at this stage, and that speaks to, of course, how Moscow and how the Assad regime wants to engage mainly with the Europeans on the conditions for financing, in the context of what Steve mentioned, the broader sort of concept of inclusive reconstruction underpinned by political peace.
No, I agree with everything that Ali has said, but I'd like to suggest that there are a large number of different ways, different pathways that might define how reconstruction unfolds. I do think we have to step back for a moment, though, and recognize that this figure that routinely gets thrown out of 250 billion or 300 billion, or as Assad himself said at one point, 400, this is all nonsense. I mean, this is a narrative intended to create the impression among potential participants in reconstruction of the dire urgency of their throwing money into reconstruction immediately. When you step back to think about it, I would imagine that the carrying capacity of the global reconstruction architecture is no more than a couple of $2 billion a year. You know, Brussels, again, $9 billion in humanitarian aid was requested. Only $7 billion was pledged. Actual contributions tend to fall about 30–40% short of pledges. So let's be real about what we're talking about. We're talking about a slow process, even under the best possible scenario of international participation. Barring international, Western EU participation, barring that, I think we can look at a number of different ways in which reconstruction might unfold. It could unfold through an Iranian-led path, in which the focus of reconstruction would be to tighten the integration of the Syrian and Iranian economies. There is a Russian-led path, in which the process of reconstruction would probably emphasize resource extraction and the deepening of Russian control over those economic sectors that offer it profit-making opportunities, with less attention to other dimensions of reconstruction. There is a Chinese-led path, which might focus on the development of infrastructure that would support China's large Silk Road plan. And this $2 billion investment in a kind of manufacturing and transport center in the north of Syria around Aleppo is consistent with what China sees as what it would like to use Syria for in its own global economic ambitions. There's a private sector-led process, which would be very small, but might focus on the reconstruction of industry manufacturing in certain select areas. For example, the reconstruction of the industrial zone just outside Aleppo that was looted by actors in the height of the conflict in that area. We could imagine a regime-led process in which funds are secured through taxes that are currently being posed on Syrians to go toward reconstruction funding led by the regime. We could also imagine a diaspora-led process in which there are outside resources that move through family and other kinds of networks into the country to support a bottom-up process of small-scale and very, very uneven reconstruction. Now, all of those exist. One does not imply that others won't be present, but we can imagine different pathways depending on which of them might take the lead in how reconstruction processes are shaped. So the key point, I think, is to recognize that the absence of Western funding, the absence of EU funding or perhaps of Japanese funding from reconstruction doesn't mean reconstruction will not happen. And as you said, Neil, it's already beginning, and ensuring that a reconstruction process has begun is part of this strategy on the part of the regime to narrow opportunities for outside actors to have an influence in how it's structured. So these things are all very much connected.
So Nada, how, amongst these different pathways, how do we, and we, I just mean the royal we, how do we sort of ensure that the EU, ensure that the Western players sort of step up and, I don't know, resist that glacier and push it in a different direction? Or does it just simply continue?
No, I think there's a strong role to play for European countries, not necessarily the EU, but individual European countries and Western institutions in this reconstruction process. Let me start by agreeing with what my colleagues were saying. We have to really put reconstruction into focus. And starting with Stephen's point, the number that's being thrown around currently, $400 billion, if you look at how that is generated, it's actually the cost of conflict. The vast majority of that estimate is lost economic activity that took place. It's not so much the physical damage that was done, although the physical damage was incredible and very costly. And Stephen also mentioned that there's an absorption capacity. It's very difficult for the Syrian regime or institutions to be able to do a lot with this money unless they sell you these big reconstruction. They're not even reconstruction projects. They are construction projects. These new big cities and nothing else. That's not reconstruction. That's just new construction. And it's very important not to fall into that kind of narrative or that trap. And Stephen laid out that what different players could do in terms of reconstruction at the smaller scale. But their incentives are not quite aligned necessarily with the interests of the Syrian people. And this is the problem. So the Chinese want to get a return on their investment. The Russians are interested in extracting resources. So the question then is, if you start to think about, okay, what do we want to do in terms of supporting, let's call it redevelopment, livelihood support, helping people to be able to pick up their lives, return back to their communities, that's a very different set of questions. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about what those mean. There is an opportunity to support financing, and Besma said this in the previous session. There's not enough money going towards rebuilding lives and supporting livelihoods. And funneling money and projects in that direction actually can help create a virtuous cycle. If you're looking at reconstruction at the community level, if you're looking at helping support villages that were destroyed by conflict, including villages that rose up against the regime or its allies in the conflict are not going to support those. They're interested in the main cities, they're interested in the main arteries connecting those cities. Those areas are going to probably not receive the attention they need unless somebody else comes in and supports them. So what are we talking about? Livelihoods. Besma talked about agricultural activity, supporting farmers to go back in terms of seeds, in terms of tools. This is very important. Number one, they've lost a lot of their assets. And they're not going to get started without farming is a cycle. You basically reap the harvest, you get money, then you plan for the next cycle. Without support, that cycle doesn't restart properly. There's also risk involved. Why would you invest in starting up your farm again if there's a chance that conflict may resume? So there's a lot that donors can do to support livelihood in terms of redeveloping the rural economy of the country. And all that redeveloping the rural economy of the country then supports in terms of providing food on the table for other Syrians, right? So it addresses the issues of food security. Same thing with reconstruction at a community level. That needs somebody to come in and provide support and provide funding to get economic activity going. Let me give an example now that will take even a step back about what donors can do. That doesn't necessarily relate to supporting the regime. One of the biggest sectors hit in this conflict, as we know, is education and training. You want people to go back and re-engage and rebuild their livelihoods, but you don't necessarily have the skills. You have people that have been out of the market for a long time. Just some numbers. So in Syria, currently 8.5 million children are in need of educational support. This is 97% of school-aged children. 1/3 of school-aged children are out of school. Roughly 40% of school infrastructure has been damaged, destroyed, or converted into shelters, no longer accessible. The quality of education has suffered tremendously. According to a 1917 assessment, 52% of 7th graders assessed could not read at the equivalent of a 2nd grade level. And 63% of 7th graders could not solve a 2nd grade math problem. So now you want to basically rebuild the country and reestablish livelihoods. And the human capital isn't necessarily there to do that. What's to prevent Western countries from supporting training and education and supporting people to be able to have the tools and develop the human capital to be able to start rebuilding their lives? So that's part of the reconstruction process. And it's a part that I don't see, it doesn't align necessarily with the regime's vision for reconstruction and what they're trying to sell, but it actually gets to the grassroots issues of community redevelopment. And there's a lot that can be done in those things. And I don't want to, I think we should separate the narrative and the conversation in terms of this big concept of reconstruction that basically, yes, we're signing on because you've achieved the basic requirements, versus these project-based, targeted reconstruction, community redevelopment efforts that I think, all I can think of is some Western countries could potentially support, not any of the other players.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on some of the absolutely critical priorities that are going to be needed for Syria to put itself on a pathway back toward some form of post-conflict normalcy. And I think this notion of disaggregating reconstruction so that we're not focused entirely on these large-scale issues that we've addressed on the panel this morning is the sole way that we conceptualize it and plan for it and try to implement it. The challenge I bump up against in imagining how to proceed down that path is that the regime offers us no possibilities for pursuing a more differentiated strategy of reconstruction. Let's imagine investment in education. It would be required to go through the Ministry of Education. It would be required to work within the legal and regulatory frameworks put in place by the regime. It would be required to provide funds directly to the regime in order to do this. It would be required to work with sort of the NGOs active in the field of education and service provision that are vetted and approved by the regime and staffed by figures close to the regime. We have no capacity to control how those funds are used, how programmatic priorities are defined, who the beneficiary communities are. And in fact, quite contrary to that, the regime views all of these efforts as a chance to assert its authority. So it engages in negotiations over the smallest details about the use of reconstruction funding. And any attempt by an external actor to say, look, our organization, our government requires that we impose criteria for transparency, accountability, neutrality, inclusion in how these funds are used, the regime undermines every single one of those criteria in its insistence that unless you acknowledge our sovereignty, our authority, that we are the ones who control this process, you are not welcome to participate. So here's the challenge. Are there strategies, real meaningful strategies, to build a disaggregated process or framework of reconstruction? At the moment, I don't see it. And I think the regime, frankly, is prepared to pay the political and economic price of its own insistence on a monolithic, top-down, tightly controlled approach to reconstruction. It would prefer a less well-funded, slower process of reconstruction that provided it with complete control over a larger, better funded, more disaggregated process of reconstruction. It's made that clear consistently, including statements from Bashar al-Assad all the way down. And so I agree entirely with the framework you laid out. I think about how we might move toward that sort of a framework, and I find myself unable to identify a pathway at the moment. So what I would argue is that until we can use the more, you might say, higher level or more diplomatic or interstate or multinational sources of pressure on the regime concerning its overall approach to reconstruction in ways that might create conditions that would lead it to change, we're not going to get to this strategy. That's my concern about it.
But then, but then the question, I mean, it's very interesting, but then the question is, so you're assuming that basically the strategy of the regime is go slow, achieve the gains, and show some gains of stabilization, even if at a slower pace, to try and use that as an argument to blackmail Western audiences that, like, look, it's working and you're missing the boat, even if it's slow. I mean, what would it take to break the Western consensus on disengaging from the regime? I think that's what the question we ask ourselves, because if one looks at the typology or sort of how the West has gone back and forth into dealing with the Assad regime, at least on the political front, I mean, it was not a linear process, right? It was not very consistent so far. So what the question is, what will it break? What will it break? Well, how does this consensus break?
Let me just kind of reflect on this, because I understand that the regime has a specific agenda it's pushing, and it's trying to reestablish authority over the country, and this is a paramount issue. There's a couple of things that make me want to say there are opportunities. Now, I'm not optimistic, and I'm not trying to be naive, although I've often been accused of being optimistic and naive, but that's what keeps us going. My understanding of what happened in Syria in the conflict is at the beginning, the regime turned to its security military forces to say, deal with this crisis. It's probably, it's important not to think of the regime as one homogeneous institution. It's all the same color. There are reform elements that were in place that were marginalized during this conflict, and at some point, the powers that be within the regime are going to turn to and say, okay, you need to help deal with these other issues that we're facing right now. A few months ago, the regime was feeling very strong and optimistic, having felt it essentially won. Today, it's suffering major economic problems. It's suffering from shortages of oil and gas. It's suffering from a lot of different aspects. And it's going to have to some extent, face the realities on the ground as well. I mean, if it's selling this vision and no one's buying, then it's going to have to figure out how to make sure it provides basic services and what mechanisms it can use. Now, again, this is not an EU international all agree on this, but it's it does make sense to me to have specific European countries who might be interested in this into leading an effort to poke holes and figure out what channels you can start providing support and assistance to these communities. Monitoring that the funding that was given, and they're not about large amounts, we're talking about initially small amounts, are being used for the right purposes to improve lives and livelihoods and to rebuild communities. And then once those channels are identified, increasing resources through those channels. It's very much an iterative process. And it could be, quite possibly, that no channels exist. The regime has blocked everything except through what it considers to be the mechanisms that it wants. But it's also important to remember that some of those mechanisms might be through regime affiliates, through INGOs, even though they're under the watchful eye of various regime-aligned institutions, UN. But there's lots of parties on the ground who could be used as essentially testing grounds to figure out what could work. I don't think the right approach is to simply say we're not going to do anything until everything is aligned. I think that's a recipe for going into a scenario of Iraq in the 1990s. You have 10 years of blocking everything off, and the end of that wasn't good for anybody. You created a space where things can get worse for the people, as well as create space for non-state actors to emerge once the state becomes too weak. So I think we've been down this road in other countries, and I'm not sure the final outcome is. I think it's a final outcome they want to try to avoid, or at least test the possibility of avoiding.
John?
I can see some potential, Alia, for, well, although first I think we have to recognize that holding together a position of hesitation or reluctance to engage in reconstruction at the moment within the EU is always going to be a challenge, because there are a lot of pressures pulling different EU governments in the direction of restoring some form of ties to if not the regime, then to reconstruction or other forms of programs beyond humanitarianism in Syria. And I think they have to do with precisely the intent of avoiding an Iraq kind of Iraq 1990s kind of scenario. That said, now that I continue to come back to this question of how do we do it, right? I don't disagree at all with the ideas, but where do the possibilities exist for those kinds of small-scale, locally focused programs exist that could establish these examples that you're talking about? Now, one possibility might be precisely growing out of these so far fairly small-scale and disaggregated acts of protest about gas shortages, about poor treatment of veterans, about the lack of electricity. All of these kinds of things are creating pressures that I think the regime is experiencing quite acutely, and would like to find some way to be able to address more effectively. Whether those pressures would be sufficient to induce the regime to permit support channels to begin to be activated that would be somewhat more autonomous from its systems of control and oversight, that's an open question. It might be worth exploring those possibilities. I tend to be more pessimistic about them, but I certainly wouldn't reject the value of exploring whether they exist, at least. I will differ a little with this notion that Syria is Iraq in the 90s. You know, Syria is not under UN sanction. Right? Syria is under sanction that are bilateral, multilateral, that offer it all kinds of opportunities to sustain economic activities with key trading partners beyond the scope of sanctions. It also faces a far narrower set of sanctions than those that were imposed on Iraq in the 1990s. And in fact, it also operates under sanctions that include clauses for the exemption from sanction of goods which, if they were not available to Syrians, would cause material, health, other kind of damage. I mean, for me, one of the central problems with the existing sanctions regime is that those exemptions are not adequately taken advantage of. They're not used enough. And those who have authority over the sanctions regimes are reluctant to grant exemptions. I think that's a mistake. Pharmaceutical goods, agricultural inputs. There are some things that should be exempted from sanctions, and provisions to do so exist in the sanctions laws, but right now we're not taking enough advantage of them. But I do not see Syria today as comparable to Iraq in the 90s. It was a completely different sanctions regime, so I do think we have to bear that in mind.
Thank you. I'm going to use that as a bridge to open up to questions. I can see we have a question down here at the front, please. Thank you. If you could just wait for the mic. And same routine, if you could stand up, give us your name and your affiliation, and the microphone is just coming. I'm going to take questions in twos at the outset. So we're going to
Great, thank you. My name is Salma Kahale. I'm with Dawlati, a Syrian NGO, working on democratic transition and transitional justice. One of the things that I first wanted to say that I applaud your optimism, Nader, that there could be any hope for reform from within. I feel like, having been involved in efforts for reform from within, I feel like the 8 years of the past should have gotten us past this idea that we can reform the system from within. However, I do think that there are it's worth looking at exploring how we can support alternative ways of, supporting communities to ask to get their needs met, and to have this more bottom-up approach. We have to look for new ways. But I think we also have to admit that, what you talk about in terms of supporting education and livelihoods, this is stuff that's already going on. This is stuff that's happening. This false distinction between humanitarian, early recovery, reconstruction there is a lot of this work that's already being funded, and that's being funded maybe through, there was the 7 million pledged for humanitarian support, which talks about education and livelihoods and protection. And it's going through a lot of the agencies, and I'd like to go back to what Hayed was saying earlier, is going through these agencies, UN agencies in particular, in a way that is not questioned. It's not being questioned, and that kind of support and access that donors have is not being used to press for more inclusive, participatory, needs-based rather than access-based by the regime. So I think, yes, we need to push for that bottom-up, and we need to find those holes. We need to find those ways, because we have to find ways to support communities beyond the frameworks that the regime would like us to invest in. And we also have to do the work, donors have to do the work of pressuring for better ways of delivering all aid, not just reconstruction, early recovery aid, but even humanitarian aid. And that's not to say that it's politicized, but that it has to be human rights-based approach, which is what the UN says is their framework for their interventions in Syria. And they're not doing that. They're not helping INGOs do that. They're not helping civil society, and they're not helping the Syrian people when they just give it to the UN and say, okay, you deal with it. We're not going to deal with it. We want to stay as far away from this mess as possible. And this is also in terms of their support for Syrian civil society or other actors who are trying to do this work that you're saying about supporting things bottom up, supporting different ways. First of all, it's slow and small work, and we have to, for donors to say that it takes time to do this work, and it's not going to be big spent money, 7 billion in one go. I'm
going to have to ask you to get to your question.
I'm sorry. And then lastly, I think about that, it was one last point, and I've forgotten it, but
if you could flip to your question, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, I can't remember.
You didn't have a question to... they were very valuable comments, of course, but if you wanted to ask a question, please do.
I think I think it's just about how do we, just to look at beyond going into this dichotomy between reconstruction, humanitarian aid. How do we do that? And how do we press for better conditions for delivering all kinds of support in Syria?
Thank you very much. We have a question down here at the front as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Salim Salameh, Syrian-Palestinian researcher based in London. Steve, you talked about the high-level kind of strategy in order to pressure the regime so we can move forward in a productive kind of pathway. But at the same time, Nader, you're talking about the provision of services being important to think of as well. And as Hayed highlighted in the first session, also services are being instrumentalized, right, in one way or another. So what we know about education is two pieces. The first is that education in rebel recaptured areas by the regime is being used as a tool of discipline. And education in rebel-held areas, by a recent research by DFID, shows that there is a huge work to do in order to improve learning outcomes. And my question is, based on also your recent work on youth employment and skills in the MENA region, how can we really push, as Salma was saying, UNICEF and others to do more than distributing school bags? Because it's really embarrassing after 8 years that we are only distributing school bags. But also, how can we do this really effectively, as in, to use your terms, to oversee the overseers, as to streamline the procedures and the work? And I know there is a lot of donors in this room, and after 8 years, we can do a little bit better about education, especially education. And in a way, as Salma was saying, to make this part of the agenda, but not only until we reach some sort of a high-level agreement, because quite frankly, especially after Brussels III, I don't know how many more years we will have to wait. So what are our maneuver landscape or margin?
Thank you very much. Who would like to take those questions? Steve, do you want to kick off with one?
It's for you, and then we can add.
Yeah, Nader, go ahead, please.
So I think, a couple of points. First of all, yes, it's going beyond the humanitarian, absolutely. And there are, to my mind, the trick is poking holes, finding what works, and trying to expand them slowly. I think these have to be, you have to have some conditionality there. Stephen's already mentioned this. But it's kind of a conversation that has to take place. If things are being used in ways that are not supportive of human rights, they're being used of tools to repress, then donors have obligation to say, that's not what we're into, and they withdraw. That has to be on the table. That has to take place. Whenever is the issue of the donors of issue of conditionality, they balk and they say that hasn't worked in the past. But it hasn't worked in the past, I think, because at some point you need to actually. The donors have to be able to be willing to pull the plug. And sometimes they feel once they start, it's difficult to stop. And I understand this logic. So that has to be a kind of a donor discussion among themselves and agree on the modalities before they actually jump in. So that's part of the deal. The second thing is the issue of being incremental and getting proper feedback. I think it's important to establish clear guidelines. And I don't think they have to be many, but you can imagine saying, we're going to support this on the condition that a child in school isn't subject to certain practices that are against their human rights. Now, what you can do there is basically have zero tolerance. And that can be made clear from the beginning. You need one example. If it happens, you require the regime to do something about it. If they don't, then you break it. So introducing a zero tolerance policy, and not across like 10 indicators, but pick something specific to an individual program. That kind of generates a point of discussion and an ability to hold people accountable. The way you don't hold people accountable either is you don't have any kind of conditions or mechanism, or you have too many, so that it's impossible. And this is oftentimes where things break down. So to some extent, it's up to the donors to devise mechanisms that will actually get to the issue, and donors, and then following that, UN agencies, because they're using donor funding, to agree on mechanisms that they can feel comfortable with that align with this, and then to post host. So there's one step before that has to take place. I don't think those conversations are happening enough, and I think that's part of the process that needs to be focused on. So.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, Personally, I tend to be most skeptical about the potential for more productive use of UN-based programs, simply because, like UNICEF, simply because the UN is a state-based organization that adheres to international law concerning the imperative of sovereignty and the recognition of sovereign governments and non-intervention in internal affairs, and all of the UN agencies operate under constraints that are imposed on them from the political leadership of the UN. And so I tend to think that if we're looking for innovation and a responsiveness to local needs from these agencies, which I know many of the staff of these agencies would vastly prefer to where they are now, moving that kind of approach through the UN system, I think is going to be very difficult if it can occur at all. Where are there possibilities to try to build some of these approaches to reconstruction that might not fall victim to the kinds of challenges we've discussed here? It may be, for instance, that some of the very significant sources of discontent and grievance that are emerging in the transition from conflict to a kind of authoritarian peace in Syria hold out some possibilities. Protests about fuel, about electricity, about mistreatment or poor treatment of veterans, about lack of social services, social provision, all the rest. And where those might be exploited, I think, though, we have to be very careful in how we proceed. Are there opportunities, for instance, to build civil society, transnational civil society alliances responsive to those kinds of grassroots pressures from below, so that non-state actors outside of Syria could find ways to lend support to counterparts inside the country to legitimate and amplify the visibility of the sorts of grievances that are being expressed, and to propose solutions to respond to the problems that generated those grievances that do not automatically include a role for the state. And what you're doing, in effect, is building domestic constituencies for forms of reconstruction support that may fall outside or have the potential to fall outside or to work around the regime. Whether those would be implementable, I don't know. I think the possibility that they could be implementable might go up if there was also very clear-sighted focus on which territories were most amenable to those kinds of transnational civil society coalitions. And Daraa actually strikes me as one for precisely the reasons that Hyde mentioned in the first panel. The local actors there, because at least those which moved quickly to reach agreements with Russia concerning demilitarization and reintegration into the regimes, into the regime, those are areas which have preserved a measure of autonomy, and where Russia is an effective buffer to some extent between local actors and the regime in some of these communities. Those might be the places where we could explore incubating some of these strategies. But I agree with you completely. There has to be a willingness to walk away. It is very hard for international humanitarian actors to do nothing. It is very hard for them to conclude that what they're doing isn't working and they have to stop. Yeah, I've never met an international aid worker who said, I have to stop. Right? And yet that must be part of the calculus about getting involved in the first place.
Anna, did you want to?
Yeah, I think something that, again, from the Lebanese experience, I fully agree it's a different model in the sense that we had a situation where actually there was too little state, which allowed donors to embrace the sort of very proactive civil society, and that allowed the state actually to be void of its own ability of cohesive action. It's a completely different model, but obviously most of the community development projects that happen allowed a much faster reconstruction at a time where the state was not able to absorb it. So the question is, will there be a point where, as Nader said, when you hit the bottlenecks of absorptive capacity of the state, will then state institutions be willing to become more flexible and then allow a more sort of community-based type of project-led development projects. The other issue also that we have seen in other countries, because basically part of the recovery or the reconstruction is about reconstructing also the social fabric and making people talk to each other. I think this is where also, again, in Lebanon, but also in Iraq and in other places, UN agencies, particularly UNICEF, were funding projects that allow for intra-communal dialogues, right? I don't know to what extent this is tried by local actors in Syria or not, but for example, and through that, there was a lot of education-related projects for kids that were out of school in areas where schools were not provided. So we used, the project in Lebanon was called Tarbiya ala Salam, Education for Peace program, and it trained all Lebanese across all countries, and it made basically Sunnis and Shias and Christians to come together when for 15 years they were unable to talk to each other. So the UN, some UN agencies or programs can be used for this sort of a reconstruction of the social fabric where you needed it. And then the last point, and I don't know to what extent this form of funding can be sort of can go through, but it's more has to do with jobs and livelihood of people. Is the large-scale microfinance type of projects, right? That helped in many areas, basically prevent, create some sorts of social safety net, but also it was complemented by capacity building projects and type of funding that allowed people who were receiving and building the microfinance intermediaries to train others on skills and jobs and allow them to become basically productive. And this is all small scale. I'm trying to be in your sort of small scale logic and that of Steve. And there are a lot of examples that can be done.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 questions. I can see mostly men with their hands in the air, so it would be great if some women would ask some questions. We'll take one at the back here, please, right on the side there. Thank you very much.
Thanks. James Gavin, journalist. Do you see any active courting of Gulf investors, for example, for some of those real estate projects in Damascus, both as a source of investment and revenue, but also to counterbalance the Iranian, the sort of perception of growing Iranian presence in Syria?
Thank you very much. We've got 2 questions down here at the front, please. Thank you. Right down at the front. Sorry, right down here, and the gentleman behind him as well. Thank you.
Thank you. David Butter, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Picking up a little bit on what Ali was going into, we saw from Brussels III a package of $20.8 billion of loans from multilateral and bilateral organizations, most of that from the European Bank, Reconstruction, and the European Investment Bank. Now, my understanding of this is that these loans it's a number, it's a very big number, it's tied up into some sort of political trade-off. If we have a Geneva deal, then you can have the loans, but clearly that's not going to happen. I was just wondering, in the space between the tracks, particularly looking at the way the EBRD works, is that they do have provision for supporting private sector companies, for putting money into private business, whether there is actually, to your knowledge, any kind of really thorough work investigating any sort of due diligence, or whether this entire area, so there's no such thing as a private sector you can actually go and invest in Syria, which is not contaminated in one way or another by the regime. I'm just wondering, what your feedback perhaps from these sorts of institutions is, or whether these numbers are really just a joke.
Thank you, David. If you could pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you, that would be great. Thank you.
Jonathan Steele from the website Middle East Eye. I just wanted to ask a sort of fairly fundamental question. I mean, I think most people who are realistic realize that the military opposition to Assad has failed. Isn't it time to recognize that the economic opposition is going to fail too, that if we try and put conditions on aid, like the EU has just done, as we just heard, or anybody else put economic conditions on aid, they're just continuing the war by other means. I mean, the lady here pointed out that reform from within has unfortunately failed after 8 years. Reform from without is certainly not going to succeed if reform from within hasn't worked. So my question is, shouldn't we now really think about biting the political bullet and starting dialogue with the government in Damascus, as the Gulf Cooperation Council states some of them are doing, starting to lift sanctions, because although they're not as bad as the UN oil for food sanctions in the 1990s against Iraq, they still have a devastating effect on people who are trying to set up small and medium businesses, as we heard in the first panel. Money for the INGOs going through Oxfam and Save the Children and all these sort of things are affected by banking sanctions. We've just had these new sanctions which are actually focused by the Trump administration on Iran, which prevents Iranian oil tankers bringing oil to Syria for refinement and so on, and that's having a devastating effect. And one reason why the cooking oil prices have gone up, it's because of sanctions, not because of maladministration by Assad and his people. So I'm just saying, asking whether you couldn't say, what is the consequence? What is so bad about now finally recognizing that if we recognize the war has lost by military means, regime change by other means is also not going to work, and we should recognize reality and deal with Assad as some countries are beginning to do. I mean, the West should deal with.
Thank you, that's great. Your question is very clear. So we've got 3 different questions there. Active courting of Gulf investment. Who wants to pick that one up?
I think the orientation of the Assad regime toward GCC states has, at this point at least, reflected a very clear set of political criteria in which it has been reluctant to open the door to any kind of significant opportunity, other than, of course, offering money to the regime, to governments that it viewed as supporting terror. It defines as having supported the terrorist war against the Syrian regime, the Syrian state, the Syrian people. So, there has been some effort by the UAE. What other GCC government renewed or at least reopened its embassy? Was it Bahrain? Right. But they don't exactly. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia has declined to reopen its embassy. Kuwait has declined to reopen its embassy. We know that Oman has a much stronger relation to the Assad regime. What we have not seen, on one hand, are any significant commitments of investment from those governments in Syria, and we have seen no willingness on the part of the Syrian regime to open up areas of reconstruction investment to those governments. And that's very clearly a kind of political quid pro quo that grows out of the position those governments took in the midst of the conflict. In terms of this question, though, which has been the UAE justification for its re-engagement with the Assad regime, that up until then, there were no Arab voices countering Iran's influence in Damascus. I find very little reason to treat that credibly or to view that as a serious justification. This is the latest version of a 40-year strategy to try to find ways to drive a wedge between the Assad regimes, plural, and Iran. And every single one of them has failed. And the idea that having a UAE embassy in Damascus will provide a counterweight to Iran, I think vastly exaggerates the capacity of the Emiratis to influence any form of meaningful decision-making within the Syrian regime. Now, we know exactly what will happen. The Assad regime will pocket the gains. They'll spin the renewal of relations in ways that promote the normalization of the Assad regime, its relegitimation, but there will be no significant decline in the importance or centrality of Iran's role as an actor in Syria. So it will have its cake and eat it too. And I think the UAE strategy may be based partly on a sense that there are also economic opportunities to be mined from reconstruction. Whether or how that will happen remains unclear, but I'm not entirely sure that this somewhat limited re-engagement is going to have the benefits that these GCC member states hoped for, either politically or economically.
Thank you, Steve. EBRD, Ali.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, I mean, certainly, I think this commitment is part of the EU broader strategies for host countries, and to that extent, identify projects, mainly in private sector for EBRD, but for EIB infrastructure projects that allow basically, particularly regions on border regions to Syria, whether in Lebanon or in Jordan, to fund projects that could be done there and that could have both spillovers onto the Syrian region, to the extent that the countries themselves can agree with the Syrian regime, obviously. I know that for a fact, for example, in Lebanon, there are some analysis being done for joint projects to generate electricity, but that you could basically import and export electricity to Syria, out of Lebanon, out and in of Lebanon. And these are private sector kind of investment that the EBRD or other banks can potentially support. We are still at the level of ideas, I understand. So we have the commitment to host countries, support projects, particularly where you have a lot of Syrian refugees, and the second one is projects either of infrastructure or private sector led that can be on regions bordering Syria. That's my understanding.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panel to address the final question, but I'm concerned it might take up the full 10 minutes. So before I do that, if I could just put you on notice, I'm going to ask each of you at the end of this just to give me one policy recommendation. So whilst you're all speaking or the next set of questions come in, if you could just give me one, that would be fabulous, and I can have a list of 3 at the end of this session. Military option has failed. The economic option has failed. It's time to bite the bullet. Who wants to pick that one up?
I think, no, it's an important question. And I think I'll take a step back. Right now, I think, let's assume we're talking about Western institutions and Western governments. Things are not, they're not really, it's not clear what they used to stand for something. There used to be certain values, principles, not always, consistent in terms of how they stand. But I think the U.S. right now is dealing with administration that is more transactional and less about being the defender of or the leader of the free world. I think Europe is preoccupied with Brexit, and I have question marks about their rather positive relationship with a place like Egypt, for example, that has returned not just to authoritarian rule, but even a worse situation than it was under Mubarak. So I think the first step is for kind of an internal conversation to take place among Western governments about what it is they stand for, and then to project those values and try to stand for them. Democracy in the world has been advancing at a positive pace for probably 50 years, and it's only in the past 5 years that it's backslid across the world. I think we need to take out an advertisement, maybe, leader of the free world wanted, please, applications accepted at some place. But I think that's a place to start. So I understand what you're saying. At some point, you have to accept reality on the ground and then figure out how to engage. But the next step is, how do you engage? On what basis? On what principles? Are you going to be consistent with one country versus another country? Yes, Syria has gone through a terrible time with 500,000 people dead and over 7 million refugees and internally displaced people, so it's not the same context as Egypt. At the same time, you need to figure out how you're going to how are you going to engage with regimes that don't share your values necessarily? I think that's the place to start. But then your question is very valid. What do you do after that?
Just briefly on that one question, I know too little about the loans that were offered in this recent Brussels session to feel comfortable commenting on those. But with respect to this issue of shouldn't we just get over ourselves and accept what's happened in Syria and re-engage economically because failure to do so imposes costs on ordinary Syrians? Well, I think it is certainly the case that there are ordinary Syrians who may be harmed by sanctions. But we also have to be real, and we have to acknowledge that the way the Assad regime manages the economy also imposes significant harm on Syrian civilians. It isn't as if corruption, predation, exclusion are a product of sanctions, or even, although the war greatly amplified these features of the economy, as if they are simply a product of war. This is a predatory, corrupt, exclusionary, extortionary regime that had managed the economy in those ways long prior to the onset of the conflict. So let's make sure that we acknowledge the domestic sources of Syria's economic crisis and the domestic drivers from the regime of the economic conditions in which Syrians find themselves. Now that said, I think we have to recognize that what we're looking at is in effect a trade-off, right? We have the impact of sanctions on Syrians. We have the impact of an approach to reconstruction that the regime has already initiated, which is causing significant harm to Syrians, denying hundreds of thousands of people the possibility of returning home, allocating resources in ways that deprive and harm the well-being of communities that are not viewed as sufficiently loyalist, embracing this approach to reconstruction, which is intended to advance projects of demographic change, advancing a project of reconstruction which is intended to insulate the regime from accountability, right, for its conduct during the war. So we need to think about what kind of trade-offs would be associated with pursuing this approach that you suggested. Are we prepared to be complicit in a reconstruction strategy which is about the reimposition of corrupt, predatory, exclusionary economic governance over all of Syria, which normalizes and legitimates a regime with no possibility for accountability for its conduct during the war, which accepts the demographic re-engineering of the country as the cost of accepting that the regime has won militarily, and depriving ourselves of what remains pretty much the only potential source of leverage through which we might induce change in the regime, whether through these top-down or these bottom-up strategies that we've been discussing here. I don't find those are acceptable trade-offs. Others may differ. But from my perspective, to accept those trade-offs would be a significant failure on the part of the international community. So I don't think we are at a stage at which we should simply concede on the possibility for changing conduct, for pursuing accountability, for rejecting the legitimacy of the regime that conducted itself in the way it did during the war, for rejecting its attempts to re-engineer Syria's social fabric. I would prefer to sustain a policy which reflects our rejection of those practices rather than simply shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's done.
Thank you very much. And we're going to have to bring this session to a close. There are a few outstanding questions. I apologize I didn't take those. We have a few policymakers in the room, and I would really much appreciate, based on those conversations and our whole conference is towards inclusive peace building, what sort of one policy recommendation would you deposit with them as they leave the room and head up for lunch? And allow me just to inscribe in my little pad here.
Well, I want to pick on one point that Steve, and maybe extrapolate in terms of something concrete that can be happen. You called it transnational civil society. I think one dimension of the inclusive reconstruction is the external dimension of the refugees of the Syrian refugees that sit in all the sort of either neighboring countries or even abroad, and which over the last 8 years have grown in terms of forming a civil society that has strong skills, that has vision of what the country, where it wants to take the country, and that investing also in this civil society and funding projects that can trickle even through small ways into Syria is maybe also an important approach to pursue and to consolidate over time, because that's also part of being inclusive, given the extent of the refugee scale, and also their contribution, if not now, continuously and certainly into the future.
Thanks. Thanks, Neil. I think I can be pretty brief on this one. I endorse the general approach adopted by the EU of withholding reconstruction funding until we see progress toward a meaningful political settlement or transition. But let's acknowledge that the phrase meaningful political transition or settlement is far too vague to be meaningful. And I would suggest that the EU invest the time and take the risk to lay out in far more detail what that means. Let's see a framework identifying what would need to happen in order to meet those criteria. The EU is benefiting from what I'm sure it views as constructive ambiguity about the terms of that phrase, because it helps it hold its internal coalition or its within EU coalition together around that principle. But we need to acknowledge it's not enough. So let's put that framework together. Let's offer some details. Let's lay out a conception of what that would mean, how we would get there. And we're then in a position to say, look, if you meet steps 1, 2, and 3, we'll deliver some relief, right? As long as we're confident that those conditions have been met. It provides a chance for a more articulated approach to moving toward a situation in which normalization becomes possible. But as long as the political pressures push against a more detailed statement, I do worry that people will simply abandon it because they recognize it as an ineffective tool for achieving meaningful ends.
Thank you, Steve. And now to finance.
I think at the same time, it'll be good if the EU does agree within its community for maybe 1 or 2 countries. One, to take the lead on engaging at these more community-based approaches. I think you should keep essentially requirements and conditionality fairly clear at a high level, but actually then test the waters, figure out where you could potentially build in terms of finding ways of really empowering and supporting community redevelopment. Now, one caveat to that is I think the issue of conditionality is very important, and I think they need to be willing. That's why it's important not to have a divide and conquer. You have multiple players in play, and if one doesn't give you the second one will. This needs to be done under a very clear conditionality where you, ideally, one indicator where you have basically zero tolerance, because you can build on that. If you have one avenue, one string that there's an agreement that this is outside the ability to manipulate or to control, and you have strong monitoring system in place, it creates at least one point of a conversation where you can say no. And I think that's very important, because I believe you can actually build a lot when you find one good, strong example of something working right, even if it's a tiny piece of the puzzle. It becomes a foundation. So that's it.
Thank you very much. You've been a fantastic panel. I think that was a very rich conversation, and hopefully the rest of the audience appreciated that. If you could join me in thanking our hosts. Thank you.